in the room, which makes, when somebody says David, everybody looks around to see which one is being identified. And morning to all the sisters, brothers, comrades. My apologies for getting in late yesterday. There were some initial logistical issues and so on. And then when I spoke with Bobby, I think it was on Wednesday night, Bobby said yes, they would still make an effort to come. So I then decided to take part in the ceremony which we had in Trinidad yesterday morning to mark the 41st anniversary of the bombing of the Cubana flight at Piarco Airport, because last year on the occasion of the 40th anniversary, we were able to get the government to put up a plaque in the airport, which was something that is unprecedented because the government of Trinidad and Tobago historically never recognizes events like that and so on. But when we had done the research before, and it was actually the Trinidad and Tobago police officers who were able to get the evidence that same day, because they arrested the two Venezuelans who planted the bomb on the Cubana flight, because the Venezuelans had come into Trinidad from Caracas the day before, and then boarded the Cubana flight in Port of Spain, got to Barbados, and then came off the plane, left the bombs, and went back to Trinidad. And the police, and they actually were two very right-wing fascist police. Dennis Randy Burrows, Kappa Kappa, but they actually did a good job in this regard, because we actually last year got all the notes of their investigation, and it's very detailed notes of the interrogation and all the reports and so on, in which the two Venezuelans confessed not only to planting the bomb, but pointed to Posada Carriles and so on, who were the masterminds in Caracas, which led to the arrest of Posada Carriles. And the second person, I'm trying to remember the name, Orlando Bosch, thank you very much, led to their arrest in Caracas, and so on. So it was, and to the involvement of the CIA, because the guys confessed that it was a whole CIA operation and so on. So they got the hard evidence. And there was a top-level meeting in Port of Spain within days of that, which involved representatives of the governments of Cuba, Venezuela, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, and so on, to identify where the judicial proceedings should take place. And it was agreed between everyone, apparently, that the judicial proceedings should take place in Venezuela. And the Venezuelans arrested Bosch and Posada Carriles, and we know how they got out after that and so on. But so Trinidad has a key, and was a key part of that whole process, and so we were able to put up a plaque yesterday. So I took part in that and then came across it, so my apologies for not getting the time to present. So I was asked to share a few thoughts on the economic crisis and social collapse of the Caribbean, which I think we all know because we all live it every day. So I'm just trying to just make a few bullet points in that regard. Essentially, first of all, to say that the economic crisis is essentially a crisis of neoliberal capitalism. I think that's the first point that we have to establish. And of course, in the context of the Caribbean, it is given our historical creation of the modern Caribbean as plantation economy, which of course meant that we were always a part of the global capitalist system, linked to industrial capital, whether it was in France or Holland or Britain or Spain, as the case may be, and generated the wealth out of slavery and sugar, which essentially financed the Industrial Revolution. So we have been part of, when people talk about globalization, the first process of globalization, if you wish, was that slave sugar economy, and which linked Africa, Europe, and the Caribbean, and of course North America, South America as well. And so that was really the first process of globalization. And so globalization for us ought to be nothing new. But we have some particular manifestations of the economic crisis today, which are impacting, have fundamental impacts on the social relations, and therefore accelerating, exacerbating, if you wish, the social collapse. And those are debt. Virtually every Caribbean country is in extreme debt. Barbados, which prided itself on being a highly organized economy, well managed and so on, now has a debt to GDP ratio which must be approaching 100%. Trinidad and Tobago, which had a huge increase in our GDP almost tripled between 1995 and 2008, almost tripled our GDP. Government revenue jumped from about 14 billion Trinidad dollars, say $2.5 billion US dollars in late 1990s to $60 billion in 2013-14. So huge increases in the economic rents which we got from oil and gas, and today we now have a huge fiscal crisis, debt to GDP of approaching 70% and growing and so on. And all of our countries have fiscal crises where government revenue is way short of expenditure, and of course expenditure is way short of what is required to address the social needs of our populations. So even in Trinidad and Tobago, a few days ago, after his presentation of the budget by the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Finance was interviewed, and he said last year, or within the last financial year, which ended September of 2017, he said that the government had to borrow on several occasions just to pay public servants. Now that was unheard of in Trinidad and Tobago. You had situations where governments in Grenada, St. Vincent and other places would run down to Trinidad to borrow a couple million US dollars to pay public servants. But Trinidad and Tobago never had a problem for the last 20 years of meeting payment to public servants, but we now have. That is the extent to which the problem is there. Now, given the nature of our economies, it means therefore that we are extremely vulnerable to external shocks, be they what happens on the global commodity markets and so on, whether it be crises of not only geopolitical natures, but also other kinds of crises and so on, including war or the threat of war. Those things impact very significantly on the demand for whatever we are selling, whether it be a tourism product, whether it be oil or natural gas or bauxite or whatever we happen to be selling. And so we're very vulnerable to those external threats and shocks, but we are also very vulnerable, as we all know only too well, to climate change and the threats of natural disaster, which can wipe out, as happened to Dominica in the space of a couple of hours, wipe out an entire economy within literally a few hours. There's a third major economic issue that we have to be very concerned about, which is the shortage within the domestic economy of foreign exchange because of the very high imports of not only our desire to import in terms of our tastes and so on and our culture, but the actual structure of our economy, as Lloyd Best said. We produce what we don't consume and we consume what we don't produce. And therefore, foreign exchange is the critical lifeblood of our economies. And there is a major crisis with respect to that, particularly in a liberalized economic environment where capital flight is not only economically rational for those who move their money out, but is totally legal and so on. In fact, in Trinidad and Tobago, in the domestic banking sector, 1/4 of all bank deposits are in US dollar accounts, but Trinidad and Tobago has a foreign exchange crisis. So we have 24 billion TT dollars, about 3.5, 3 billion and a bit more US dollars in US dollar bank accounts in our commercial banks in Trinidad, which is 1/4 of all bank deposits, including fixed deposits, savings accounts, and other kinds of deposits. And that just says where people are going in that they prefer to save in US dollars than in Trinidad and Tobago dollars. And those US dollars are not available to pay for imports of goods and services if there's a cash crisis in foreign exchange. Now, our governments over the years adopted, in general terms, the neoliberal ideological and policy agenda when Margaret Thatcher said in the 1980s that there is no alternative, Tina, that the only way you can go is market-driven, liberalized economies where regulations are removed, controls are removed. The state is not to be an actor as an economic actor, but to be a facilitator of the private sector, and so on and so on and so on. We know that whole mantra. And most of our governments adopted, to one degree or the other, that particular mantra. So even as in Trinidad and Tobago and some other countries, still very large state sector, on the other hand, other policies of liberalization, trade liberalization, currency and financial liberalization, and so on, took place. And so other countries liberalized more than others, but essentially we embraced neoliberal policy measures. What essentially neoliberalism is about was really a dismantling or destruction of the post-World War II social settlement. The post-World War II social settlement was a social settlement of social democracy, where the Western countries, having had the experience of the collapse in 1929 of Wall Street and that whole economic collapse and so on, leading to mass unemployment, leading to poverty on a huge scale, but politically creating the conditions for fascism. And so those economic conditions that were created for the rise of populism and fascism, the Western countries decided that that was not something that should happen again, and so the ideological, if not political position of social democracy was established with its economic manifestations. And essentially, that said that the state must be a welfare state, not in terms of handing out welfare, but a state that would be responsible for the well-being and welfare of the people. So issues such as subsidized education, health, water, public transport, public housing, those were key elements. And to finance that, the state then had either high taxes on the wealthy, and therefore there was a transfer of some wealth from the wealthy through the state by way of social benefits and so on. And also the development of state enterprises to control the major industries and resources and so on of those countries. And also giving a great role, or important role, or great importance and important role to trade unions for unionization, and therefore to, through collective bargaining, raising the incomes and therefore the quality of life of the majority of the workers. And therefore, within that context, trying to create political stability, which of course was then expressed through liberal Western parliamentary democracy and so on, but maintaining the capitalist economic system essentially intact. So I mean, I'm summarizing very briefly and therefore not 100% accurate ideologically, but I hope people capture what I'm trying to say in a few minutes. That was social democracy. And that position was then also manifest in our part of the world and elsewhere that were colonies because of the process of decolonization, which process, of course, was identified very significantly at the 5th Pan-African Conference in Manchester, where the agenda for decolonization was essentially set out under the leadership of Trinidadian George Padmore and others. And many West Indian labor leaders, including the President General at the time of the union that I was part of for 39 years, John Ross, was part of that Pan-African Conference because they came out of a WFTU conference in Europe and came to Manchester on the way back to the Caribbean and so on. And you had people like Kwame Nkrumah notably and others, Jomo Kenyatta and so on, who participated in that 5th Pan-African Conference. Now, we then pursued decolonization, moving to independence. It is also to be notable that the Caribbean labor leaders that had been meeting from 1926, the British West Indian and British Guyana labor leaders meeting first in 1926 in Georgetown and then 32 in Dominica. 38, there was a very important meeting in Trinidad, and in Arthur Lewis's little book called Labor in the West Indies, which was written in 38-39, when he chronicled all of the labor revolts and insurrections, general strikes and insurrections in the West Indies. He put as part of the appendix the resolutions coming out of the Conference of Labor Leaders. And those conferences spoke and demanded nationalization of sugar, the breakup of the sugar factories, the breakup of the plantations, and the creation of peasant and or cooperative farms, public health, housing, education. It was a very, very broad, not just, of course, independent self-government, adult franchise, federation, the political parts of the agenda. There were major economic plans, and of course there were social policies as well. It was a very far-ranging and very radical progressive agenda for change coming out of the labor movement in the 1930s, which in a sense set the agenda going forward. So we became independent, and then in the 60s and 70s at various points in time, began to assert, not just in the West Indies, but throughout the Third World and so on, assert greater control over our resources. OPEC 1973, pushing up the price of oil. You had the bauxite producing countries. You had the whole push for the new international economic order. Nationalizations of multinational corporations was taking place in many parts of the Third World and so on. And therefore, there was really beginning to be mounted a challenge to transnational capital globally. And that created a crisis in capitalism, which resulted, for example, in Nixon delinking the US dollar from the gold standard and many other policies that began to take place in the early 70s. And then in the 80s came the Reagan-Thatcher axis and the use of the debt crisis at the time to have the IMF and World Bank and other multilateral institutions like the IDB and so on begin to implement what we called at the time structural adjustment measures, which we saw as isolated policies, but really later on have come to be identified as part of a whole of neoliberal capitalism and so on. So you had therefore the reversal of that post-World War II social settlement of social democracy, and therefore privatizations, attacks on trade unions, the liberalizing of the economy in such a way that capital has free movement, little regulatory controls over capitalism and so on capital. And several things have resulted. One, of course, was the fact that within countries, there's been a growing inequality of wealth and income. It is not only income. We sometimes focus on income of the top CEOs earning X hundred times the average wage of the employee in their company. And that gap has been growing. But there's also the gap of wealth, in other words, who owns assets that are now generating wealth and income going forward. And it is both, therefore, a growing gap of wealth and income. So that is one. There's also the gap of wealth and income between countries, which has been growing. There is also the fact that capitalism has become essentially driven by finance capital, where finance has been almost disconnected from productive capital, so that money makes money by way of speculative, what people call casino capitalism and so on, by way of speculation. And that is what is the largest section of the capitalist economy now, is the financial sector, finance capital, which generates money from money on stocks and bonds and hedging on commodities and all of those things that take place, and which have absolutely nothing to do with how ordinary people live their lives in terms of production, but determine the price of everything that ordinary people either produce as workers or have to buy as commodities and products and services and so on. So we have this process that is underway. And therefore, in all of our societies, not just in the developed so-called countries of the north, but in our countries, the gap of wealth and income has become greater. And ironically, it is some of the world's wealthiest people who have pointed that out to be the most serious threat to the stability of their own countries. Warren Buffett speaks about it, Bill Gates speaks about it, others are speaking about it. And you should read Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, and his book, The Price of Inequality, where he points out that this is the most pressing issue of the Western world, of the growing inequality. Warren Buffett points out that 25 or 30 years ago, there were only 20 billionaires or whatever it was in the United States. Now there are 400 or 500. The figures are not the point, is the scale that I'm talking about. And the relative wealth that those 20 fellas had then, of which he may have been one, is minuscule to the wealth that the 400 of them have today, right? So that what the system has done is produce so many more. Together, the world's 400 richest people have the same wealth as the poorest 50% of the world's population, and so on. And one study has recently been done which shows that in countries where there is greater income inequality, social mobility is less. And so I have a report, I forgot to pick it up and walk with it when I left home, that it said that if you want to live the American dream, you know, the so-called American dream of social mobility, that anybody could become president and so on and so on. That's what Barack Obama epitomized the American dream in that regard, and that you could become what they call middle class in terms of owning a home and a car and sending the children to university or whatever, so-called American dream, have consumption, etc., etc. The so-called American dream. They said if you want to live the American dream, you better live in Denmark, because Denmark has a much smaller gap of wealth and income of inequality and much higher social mobility than the United States. So that the United States and the UK, which are the countries that pursue neoliberalism most and so on, have much lower social mobility than the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, which have maintained more elements of social democracy than the UK and certainly the United States. So what does this translate now into our own scenario? In our own scenario, in the context of fiscal crisis, debt crisis, foreign exchange crisis, and so on, huge threat to our economies and lives and so on from natural disasters. This is the environment in which we are operating. The capacity of the state to deliver social needs of the population in terms of health, education, housing, public transport, water, electricity, all those basic things which are essential to human life in a civilized modern society, access to ICT and so on. The capacity of the state is significantly diminished. And the way in which our governments are addressing that is to implement neoliberal policies which in fact aggravate the problem rather than put those issues as priority in terms of expenditure or in terms of ideas that could transform the economy and transform the social relations. So there was a study done some time ago about the human index of development and so on, and Trinidad and Tobago was compared to a number of other countries, Estonia, Costa Rica, and a couple other countries, I don't remember, there's 6 countries in that group. And Trinidad and Tobago, in spite of having a very high per capita income, has, amongst those countries, the highest infant mortality rate, the highest maternal death rate, the lowest life expectancy rate, and so on, in spite of all the money that we have. And you compare that to, say, like Cuba, which has a way lower per capita income, but in the hemisphere has the lowest infant mortality rate, the lowest maternal mortality rate, the highest life expectancy rate, and so on, because of a different ideological position, and therefore different political and economic policies that flow therefrom. So, the absence, therefore, of, and if we look, I don't know what the data is for Barbados, and we should go back to Ramphal's report, Time for Action, published in 1991, I think it was, when he and the other wise men, the West Indian Commission, did that very important study of our condition. And there's a lot of data there about the educational standards in our various CARICOM countries and health standards and so on. And see, from 1991 to now, which is what, 26 years? A whole generation then. My daughter was born in 91, so it's a whole generation, right, has been born and is now working or unemployed, to see what the data is today compared to then. So that in Trinidad, 40% of all the young people who wrote CSEC, what we probably call CXC, but CSEC, failed maths and English, right? And I'm pretty sure that is not just in Trinidad and Tobago, but it's quite significant. And of course, there are others who drop out, and that a large number don't pass common entrance exams and so on. So we have a problem of an education system that is failing a lot of our young people. And therefore they are psychologically termed or deemed to be failures. Now, they're not unintelligent, they're very, very intelligent. They understand all that is going on. They may not be literate because there's a real problem with literacy, even though they go through school, even though we have free education in Trinidad and Tobago up to September of this year from early childhood all the way through university. Now, at university level, there are some fees for some people, minimum fees or partial fees and so on. But up to a year ago, free education from childhood, early childhood, all the way to university, yet we have this problem of a dysfunctional education system and so on. So in that context of a dysfunctional education system, of a system of growing inequality, of discrimination, so that if you are living in certain parts of Trinidad, which are primarily where urban African young people live, and you go for a job, and you say you are from Laventille or the Betham or something like that, you are not likely to get a job because of the stigmatization of those communities and the perception of people coming out of those communities. So there's discrimination, there is growing inequality, there's a school system that has failed our young people. We had, as a result of structural adjustment in the late 80s, early 90s, and the impact of drugs and so on as well, we had large numbers of people who lost their jobs and therefore unable to provide for their families. Many mothers migrated and children were left in the care of grandparents who weren't able to deal with that. They were going to school and not being properly supervised and a whole set of things like that. And therefore we created, economically and socially, we created a generation that is highly alienated from mainstream society. They feel no part of it, they feel no sense of ownership of the country, they feel no sense of their own power. As young people, when I was growing up, Kafra and so on, but he's a little older than me, but when we were growing up, our sense of power was to take power, was organizers on the streets. That's what Kafra did in 1969, 70, 71, and so on the streets, power to the people, to take power, to challenge the establishment, and so on. But the young people now don't feel a sense of their power that way, and therefore some of them are expressing it through gangs and so on, which give them a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, and that criminal element has replaced, in many respects, the formal state in terms of the well-being and welfare of the people in the community. So that there are major gang leaders who will, and this I know is true in Jamaica, true, very much true there, where the gang leader of Trinidad, they call him the community leader and so on, will pay for auntie to go to the doctor, buy his school books for the child who needs to go to school, and so on, give some money to a youth to be able to have to buy something for food, or buy entertainment, or whatever it is like that. So the state no longer being responsible in the neoliberal model for the well-being and welfare of all the citizens. A.N.R. Robinson famously said that the state can no longer be a tireless mother. Well, other mothers have arisen in the form of gangs and so on. And the process of socialization of many of our young people is taking place on the blocks in that environment of the gangs, rather than the old socialization of school and family and church and other institutions, sports clubs and so on. So there's a different process of socialization. Add to that the neoliberal culture of consumerism, of brands, and of aspirations, and you get the hip-hop artists saying, get rich or die trying. So we then have, and this is my last couple of points because I'm probably speaking for too long now. We then have, in terms of the culture of the gangs and the violence, we also have the economic realities of the narco trafficking, the drug trade, which is major in all of our countries, which generates huge wealth. Some people argue that 25% of the Trinidad and Tobago economy is illegal in terms of drug trade, money laundering, human trafficking, and so on. And so we cannot discount that, and that brings with it tremendous violence, because to protect that you have to engage in violent activity. And so we also have the political factor of the post-independence state, which really is in essence the old colonial state with some name changes and face changes and so on. But the way in which the political structure and systems function exclude the majority of people from participating except at election time. And people have become alienated from that, and we move from one party to the other without getting change, we get exchange, and so on. And that further creates a sense of alienation in the society. So, we therefore are in this economic crisis, exacerbated by neoliberal economic policies, in the context of a political system that has failed and given other social and cultural impacts on this. And so we really are in a state of serious collapse, in a state of political collapse, in a state of economic collapse, in a state of social collapse, and so on. And we also cannot ignore the fact that our societies were created violently. So although our people have done humongously well in terms of trying to create what Ralph has called our Caribbean civilization, which is peaceful and respectful and so on, we cannot forget or ignore the fact that we were created out of a violent process of slavery. And that culture of violence, I want to suggest, is never far from the surface. And therefore, in particular conditions that we have now, surface, that culture of violence will surface. And this is what we have to now address. I haven't tried to tackle how we get out of the economic crisis, because I wasn't asked to do that. I was just asked to deal with the economic and social, the economic crisis and the social collapse. But quite clearly, one of the challenges, and something that Bobby always talks about, is, I remember the discussions we had, Bobby, like 15 years ago, at your home with major political people from throughout the region and so on, to discuss when Tim, our friend and convert, used to insist that we come up with ideas in terms of real policies about how do we transform our economy and our political institutions, and therefore create the environment for the emergence of the Caribbean civilization in the way in which its potential exists. I don't think that we have done that work sufficiently. Some of us have been working on it, but the challenge now in the world in which we live in today, with the rise of right-wing populism and fascism, neo-fascism and so on, in the context of the globalization project, the challenge for us, as we are seeing in Venezuela, is how can we come up with a policy set? How can we implement those policies in a way that does not get completely undermined, sabotaged, and overturned by internal forces opposed to transformation and external forces, of course, who don't want it and will do anything to overturn it. So, those are my very random, disorganized thoughts on what you asked me to speak